I call on members' order of the day number 2.
Underground Coal Mining Safety Bill, first reading.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Underground Coal Mining Safety Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Transport and Industrial Relations Committee to consider the bill. Mr Speaker, like so many members' bills, this one has been some time in gestation. It was a bill I introduced after the Royal Commission hearing on the Pike River mine that had recommended, quote, an effective regulatory framework for underground coal mining should be established urgently. Mr Speaker, the Royal Commission identified through its hearings the fact that Queensland and New South Wales had arguably the best practice in this area, Mr Speaker. And so what I effectively did, and what this bill will do, was to take those Queensland mine regulations and implement them immediately into New Zealand to protect the lives of miners working underground, Mr Speaker. I'm sure that we will hear from the government the excuse that much has happened in that time, and I acknowledge that, and that there is no need for this bill. Mr Speaker, if I can take us back through a pathway. Mr Speaker, in 1994, I was given a lecture on underground mining by Bill Brazel, who was a former mines inspector, who told me that the change in the legislation in 1992 by the national government would be rued by this country, that we would be shamed by the consequences of the deregulation of mining regulations that had been established through over a century of experience, Mr Speaker. How right he was. It took some time, in fact, Mr Speaker, it was in the early 2000s, before we started to see some major faults in the practice of underground mining. The theory had been that occupational and safety and health would deal with the safety and the challenges and the risks of underground mining. In fact, a code of practice would be established and would be passed and would protect miners. That code of practice was never, ever properly implemented, Mr Speaker. And indeed, the question is, has it been implemented today? But I'll come back to that issue. The inevitable catastrophe and loss of life because of an unregulated mining environment cost the lives of 29 men at Pike River and some others before, Mr Speaker. In fact, I wrote a letter to the Minister of Labour just some months before Pike River, raising issues that had been brought to my attention about lax practices in underground mining, but was given from the Minister, who had got it from her officials, no doubt, a reassurance that all was well. Mr Speaker, this bill is my best attempt to try and protect the lives of underground miners. It was the best thing I could do, because we had let our experience and that of international miners drift into the naivety of deregulation and market forces to protect the miners at work. Mr Speaker, this takes Queensland regulations, and they're not perfect. In fact, the Pike River, some have said that Australians designed the mine, Australians ran the mine, and Australians were in part a big major cause of its disaster. Mr Speaker, but Queensland regulations, not implemented in New Zealand, would have protected those men. Mr Speaker, the government did move forward and pass legislation. In fact, the original bill they brought in was split into 3 parts. One was to set up WorkSafe, which has happened. The second was, of course, to ensure that Mines Rescue had the right authority to do its job properly. And the third was the Health and Safety and Employment Amendment Act, Mr Speaker, Pike River having been dropped from the title. That was passed in 2013, and a key component in Clause 20A is that a code of practice, an amendment to a code of practice or a revocation of a code of practice has no force or effect until it has been approved by the Minister. Mr Speaker, I rang today to see if that code of practice has been implemented, and no one could give me a reassurance that it has. Mr Speaker, we've had the establishment of a high hazard unit. We've had progress. In fact, we've had mines shut down until we could be sure that a safer regime was being carried out. And while people point the finger at Pike River, the reality was that Solid Energy, the government's own miner, had such lax practices that for 6 months their mine was closed down post Pike River. Not 1 tonne of coal came out because they too were overseeing a dangerous mining situation. Mr. Speaker, we can't take anything for granted. What I ask of the government is that they support this legislation into select committee. They may say that they've done all they can. What I say is that I want to check, and this Parliament must check, that the legislation is being implemented as intended, that the codes of practice as identified have been implemented and are up to standard, that everything that we can possibly do to make underground mining safe has been done. So I ask of the government, can you pass this, support this bill and pass it into select committee where a group of MPs from all parties can come along and we can hear submissions from people who are responsible in the mining area to give us that reassurance, Mr. Speaker. We need to know that the high hazard unit set up by the government has the proper resourcing to do the job, because the reality and one of the contributing factors to the Pike River disaster was that the Department of Labour was under-resourced. Mr. Speaker, we need an assurance that Mines Rescue, through the passage of this legislation, has the right authority to act in the best way should we ever have to face such a terrible situation again. Mr. Speaker, the legislation passed by the government oversees safety in quarries. This year, within 1 month period, we had 2 deaths in quarries in this country. Mr. Speaker, that says to us we still do not have things right. Mr. Speaker, we need to know that the people in positions of authority and people with responsibility have not only the qualifications but have the experience to oversee proper and safe workplace practice, Mr. Speaker. There are unresolved issues, Mr. Speaker. 29 men still lie in the bowels of the Pike River mine. Their families have been asked to move, some say to move on. I would never ask them to move on. If you look through history, Mr. Speaker, if you look through all cultures, one of the things we are most committed to, most passionate about, is trying to identify our loved ones whenever they are lost to us in any way. That is the driver for those 29 families, Mr. Speaker, and I would never ask them to move on. Mr. Speaker, no one's been held to account. Last week in the High Court, 2 family members were asking the court to review the decision by the government agency, that they would not proceed with the prosecution against the mine manager. Indeed, the Royal Commission report and all the reports identify clear faults in decision-making at that mine. It's not for me to judge, but it's for me to say that those families have a right to ask the question through a court of law. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Dave Whaika, a staunch advocate for mine safety, made a submission to the Royal Commission. The families of Mr. Whaika, who's unfortunately now passed away, want his submission to be made public. That has been blocked, Mr. Speaker. They are but 3 unresolved issues that I think need to be resolved. Mr. Speaker, I ask the government to support this bill into select committee, to allow Parliament to review the progress or otherwise that we've made, to question whether there's still a need for more improvement in the area of mine safety and work safety in this country, and to ensure that everything that we can do as parliamentarians has been done to prevent another mine disaster in this country. Mr. Speaker, we don't want one unnecessary death in mining or in quarrying or indeed in any workplace in New Zealand. and we should not rest until we are assured that through legislation, through the oversight of regulation, and through our commitment to the parliamentary process, that we have done everything we can to ensure that men and women, when they go to work, can return home to their loved ones and to their families. Mr. Speaker, this is what the families want most from that terrible disaster, to ensure that others don't have to suffer as they still suffer. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the government support this legislation through into select committee so we can review the progress or otherwise that we have made in this House since the Pike River mine disaster.